Cool. Thanks so much for being here, everyone. Welcome to Outside Our Bubble's second talk. Last week, we talked about unlearning racism, and today we're going to have an open conversation centered around activism and change. Our third talk will be discussing hope and self-care, and that's happening in the coming weeks, so don't forget to follow at outsideourbubble.whs for updates. So my name is Janine Padpad. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm so happy to be here, happy to be moderating this conversation, cited with 4 awesome speakers. A little bit of background on me. I graduated Walnut High School in 2017, where I was ASB Speaker of the House and I was a peer counselor. And now I'm getting ready to graduate college next year with my degrees in psychology and race and resistance under the Ethnic Studies Department. And I worked with grassroots organizations in San Francisco, where I live currently, on the College for All campaign, working to make college free again for UCs, Cal States, and community colleges in California. And before we begin, I just wanted to recognize the native land that Walnut and the San Gabriel Valley reside on, the indigenous Gabrieleño or Tongva people. And I also just wanted to kick off this talk with 2 quotes from writer and political analyst Anand Giridharadas. They go, "It's not a movement if we're not bringing in new people. Is there space among the woke for the still waking?" So we come to you today, many weeks into the ongoing rallying, organizing, and activism happening in the country and worldwide. And in all of my years growing up in Walnut, and even after, I don't recall a moment like this one. This is the real spark and tipping point, it seems to be. And I'm sure all of you watching have been finding yourself talking to friends, family, about racism. And it's also been exactly 1 month since the peaceful protest in Walnut. So through it all, we're kind of left with the question, what next? Where do we go from here? And today we hope to answer some of those questions for you, just about topics such as starting dialogue and taking action, social media, and being able to sustain the movement from different forms of change. So if you're new to Outside the Bubble, if you're just tuning in, or if you joined us last week, I'm just going to go over the format of the conversation really quickly. Participants know that you can submit questions by privately messaging the user with name submit questions here. And just a reminder, participants, don't worry, all of the questions are anonymous. I won't include any of the names of the people who are submitting questions, and I also won't mention any personal details when asking the question. And also just another reminder to everyone that this conversation will be recorded. However, only the speaker video and audio are going to be recorded. So no student information will be included in that, as long as you guys make sure to submit questions here in the chat. So great. Moving on to the speakers, we have gathered a group of critical thinkers who really match their words with their action. And right now, that's what we need, action. So as I introduce you, speakers, you can go ahead and wave, say what's up, and say hello. I'm going to start with Charmae Astillero. She's class of 2014. Charmae was involved in theater, choir, and Girls League at Walnut High School. Charmae is now a digital strategist at SKDK, where she applies her background in advertising and political affairs and political campaigns to advocate for candidates and causes. She has also led national efforts for women's and workers' rights and believes Election Day should be a federal holiday. So hi, welcome, Charmae.
Thank you, and I stand by my position on Election Day. Thanks for having me.
Agreed, cool. Moving on, next we have Joyce Chiao, class of 2009. So Joyce was involved in cross country and ran track and field at Walnut, also involved in Key Club. And Joyce is now a public sector consultant. She works with state and local government agencies across the country on their most pressing problems. Joyce also spent a number of years working in education and nonprofits. And it was working in education that Joyce, having grown up in a top performing school district like the WVUSD, she realized how disparate school systems across the country are and how important of a role we all play in making change and building equity.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here.
Cool. And next we have Willis Chen, class of 2011. Willis was in Interact and American Red Cross at Walnut. He's a native of Walnut and a University of Massachusetts Amherst graduate. Willis first became involved in political activism and civic engagement when he volunteered for various political campaigns during his college years, and he was hooked ever since. So Willis currently works as a pollster at Global Strategy Group, where he works with a variety of voter file and consumer data sets, and he also provides guidance on sampling, fielding, and analyzing public opinion surveys for a broad range of different clients. Hi, Willis.
Hey everyone, it's great to be here.
Cool. Last but not least, we have Dr. Brandon Henry. Dr. Brandon Henry is class of 2000 at Diamond Bar High School, actually, where he was in ASB. He played baseball, football, basketball, and was in BSU. So Brandon is a former collegiate athlete in baseball and football and is a member of the Diamond Bar High School Hall of Fame. Currently, he is practicing sports med at Riverside Medical Clinic, and he's a team doctor for Cal Baptist Athletics. He is also the assistant director for the Tour of Diversity in Medicine, which cultivates future minority physicians, dentists, and pharmacists along the educational pipeline. So welcome, Brandon. Welcome, everyone. And I think we can just go ahead and get into our first topic. Personally, out of high school, I came into college and I saw immediately how communities outside of Walnut and the San Gabriel Valley were different. Living in San Francisco now, a history of resistance, the city is also extremely romanticized, and it's actually one of the least accessible cities in the world. And I remember entering college, I took my first college classes, learned about things like the long 60s and all of the movements and resistance happening then, learned about things like Stonewall and the LGBTQ community and environmental racism. And I just kept asking myself, how did I not know this? How did I not know that there are actual careers, in activism and change, like all of the careers and jobs that our speakers are involved in? And that was really the shift of consciousness for me. So I'm going to start off with our first question, which is, how has your idea of meaningful change and activism evolved since your high school days? And Joyce, having had experience working in different schools across the country that are distinct from Walnut, perhaps you can start describing how that changed for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for kicking us off, Janine. And I think a lot of what you just shared really resonates with me. So I think growing up in a school district like Walnut, I never really had to think that much about like winning a school lottery, right? Or getting the classes that I wanted, making sure that my teachers were equipped to teach me when I got to those classes. And after undergrad, I became a teacher myself because I really believed in the value of our education, because I got such a great one from Walnut Valley. And I think that was when I realized that school districts really aren't the same across the board. And it really opened my eyes to the way that race and class and opportunity are so linked in our country. So for me, working in different school systems, I really started asking why. So why were my students in lower income communities of color not getting access to the same resources that I had growing up? Why was teacher turnover so high? Why were my students living in unstable housing conditions? And I think that really changed the way that I thought about activism and my part in it. Like, I wanted to make sure that I was addressing systems. I wanted to keep an eye on legislation that could really impact change. And I think that really has shaped the arc of my career. So I'm no longer in the classroom, but a lot of what I do, I consult for the government. And a lot of that is the lens that I'm looking at things through.
Yeah, definitely. I think, since leaving Walnut, we all kind of have different perceptions now of what progress looks like, and kind of just not accepting the current reality, of the country, and just like thinking and challenging these structures that you mentioned and things that we would want to change, such as, like no longer consenting to like these forms of oppression and things. So Yeah, thank you. And Brandon, we know that you're a graduate of Diamond Bar High, but still kind of grew up in our same bubble. So do you have anything to add on how your perception might have changed since Diamond Bar?
You know, it's when you think about high school, you can somewhat be protected from certain things just because depending on what you do when you're in high school. Um, Diamond Bar High was actually very interesting because it was made up of a lot of people who had moved from LA and had moved east. And so you had this kind of, when I was there, it was a large push of Black and Hispanic families that had moved east. And so but we were protected in the sense because of being an athlete. So when you're an athlete, right, you don't necessarily have certain concerns, right? The only thing I really worried about was sports and fun. I didn't worry about too much of anything else. Now, were there other things that were presented towards me, whether it was racism or whether what, not sure, right? Those are just there. But I think that as from high school and then even going into college, I still didn't necessarily understand activism and change. It honestly wasn't until I got to Howard, which is an HBCU, where I truly began to understand the idea of activism and change and just how to go about it, how to actually put 10 toes on the ground and actually get to moving to where you can actually see some kind of change, right? The idea of actually speaking up for those that are around you and speaking up on issues that are important to those that are around you. Because sometimes it's not just about speaking up about what you believe in, but it's actually speaking up for others on what they believe in and what is just as important to them. But it wasn't something that I understood on this deep of a level when I was in high school. Again, high school was just a time of, like I said, just for sports and fun. But when I got older is when I really started to understand. So yeah, the mental side of this whole kind of activism and change part is completely different, right? When I compare myself to being a 16, 17, 18-year-old versus being 38 now. So it's definitely evolved.
Right, yeah. A lot of the young people at Walnut High School and a lot of graduates were kind of seeing that, the Black Lives Matter movement, it's, something that impacts us all because we all benefited, from Black culture. And, we're really not all well until all of us are well. So yeah, thank you. And we're gonna move on to our next topic about engaging in dialogue. So whether or not, we as individuals claim we are racist, there's no denying anymore that we are born in this world that is conditioned to be racist and is historically racist through structures, policy, institutions, and government. And something difficult that we are still learning how to do is break out of our echo chamber and confront and discuss, these topics with people in our lives. So this question is going to be directed to Charmae and Willis. I know you both have early backgrounds working in politics and campaigns. I imagine that now many students are wondering, how can I best talk to my friends and family about these issues?
Do you want me to start first?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah. So, in a lot of recent events, I think it's, really, it can be really hard to, talk to friends and family about this. It can be hard to have, these important conversations. But I think at the end of the day, one would need a lot of humility to, to talk about this, because many of us may know a lot, but we don't know anything. And when we're talking to friends and family, we need to make sure that we're not like seeing them with bad intentions, and especially with social media nowadays, like people are like chewing each other out, canceling each other out. I think it's important to kind of step back and ask yourself, hey, are these actions necessary? But instead of like chewing people out, canceling people out, what about having a meaningful conversation? What about just like kind of like sitting down with them and say, hey, I saw you said this and this, and I don't think this is accurate, or this is not informed. Here, here are the facts, you know, let's talk with this, and, you know, and we're not going to, you know, no judgment at all. And I think having these very informed conversations, having these, like, you know, one-on-one conversations, you know, and with an open mind, I think will go a long way towards, you know, changing, changing opinions, especially on these very sensitive topics. And one thing that always, you know, stood out to me is, you know, speak truth to power. And speak truth to power, you know, means that, you know, if you're just talking to your peer, you know, just educating them and not calling them, you know, like ignorant, or just calling them names, or just like say like just, oh, burn those bridges. I don't think that's the way to go. And especially like later on, you might look at this and you'd be like, maybe this wasn't, you know, such a bad idea. But, you know, if you're speaking truth to power, and you're calling out like a more prominent, high profile individual who are making, you know, insensitive comments, then that's more appropriate, because they should be held accountable, and they should be they should be able to, you know, hear from us that this is not okay, and because they're much more of a high profile individual, you know, they should be held to account properly. Yeah, so that's all I have for now.
Absolutely. I think I totally agree with Willis. I think when we're starting these conversations with our friends and our family, it's always, like he said, important to recognize that, yes, these conversations are often uncomfortable, but any discomfort that we may feel, we also have to recognize does not even compare to the injustice and inequalities that Black and Indigenous people have experienced for generations. And it can also be awkward and uncomfortable because, we are forced to contend with our inherent privileges that we might not have recognized in the past, but we also have to recognize our blind spots where we might not necessarily be the most informed or the most educated or the most up-to-date on a certain topic. But I think everyone who's joined us here today, just the simple act of seeking out the information and the resources that are available and continuing to educate yourself is absolutely a great place to start. So I completely commend you all for joining us all today. And I think maybe on a more like tactical level, in speaking to friends and family, I think contextualizing all of these, the protests and the reasonings behind the mistreatment and some of the policies behind it is always a great place to start. I think some of us may have families who have backgrounds or cultural backgrounds where there are revolutions in their home countries. So maybe comparing it to something that happened back home or something, talking about it in a way that others can relate to is a good way to go about it. I'm Filipino, and recently I've been talking a lot with my mom and dad about it, and they've been talking about the protests from the Marcos regime in the Philippines, and we've been able to have really meaningful discussions around that, because I think something that happens a lot in immigrant communities, there's very much that pull yourself up by the bootstraps type of mentality that fails to recognize a lot of the privileges and inherent systems I think that we've benefited from, especially as someone who is Asian American. I have absolutely benefited from immigration policies, education policies, voting rights policies that were not necessarily fought for by my people. We didn't sacrifice as much as other people have, and I think that's important to recognize. So I think, again, contextualizing everything in a way that is more relatable for whoever your audience is, whether it's your friends, your family. Letters for Black Lives was one of the responses out of the unjust murder of Philando Castile. And I would highly encourage anyone who's interested in having these dialogues, check that out. It's a series of letters written by people from a wide variety of cultural backgrounds. So it's a great place to start, I think, to have those conversations. Another thing I've been doing with my family, we'll try to have family dinners all together every now and then, and I'll try to bring up issues of race or class in the context of what's happening in the news. So I'll kind of lead it in like, hey, did you see this in the news? Or talking about COVID-19, since that's also another thing that's so top of my mind. My mom is a nurse, and I know a lot of other Filipinos have family members or friends who work in the healthcare industry. And understanding the systemic racism in healthcare. I think it's important as we have these discussions to note that that the systemic racism isn't just in our police systems. It's so deeply rooted in so many of our institutions. So I think there are a lot of ways that you can bring up these conversations, and there's some really good tools out there. And then I think speaking more specifically to how you can speak with friends, I know I've seen a lot on my feed, and I'm sure everyone has been seeing similar things too, but a lot of people have been sharing really cool graphics and like typography type posts on social media, especially like Instagram, where you can share a post directly to your story. I've been seeing a lot of people share those. So sharing something like that to like a group chat that you have on Instagram, or like a text chain that you have with your friends, I think is a good way to get a conversation starting in a more indirect way. If it's something that you've been talking about more forcibly and top of mind with your friends. I've been a part of 1 or 2 book clubs here and there that have been more actively trying to seek out those texts that can inform us on race and the different ways it affects the systems that we live in.
More, now about the term solidarity, and, seeing that solidarity doesn't equal sameness, and how, those conversations with our families, in high school, out of high school, with our friends continue to be difficult because, like I said, I'll say it again, like solidarity doesn't equal sameness. Solidarity is the willingness to, engage in differences. And, when we get to open up that conversation and talk about our differences rather than, things that that Willis mentioned, things like cancel culture and things, like call out culture. Definitely when we focus on that, we are a lot more similar than different, but still it's important to bring up those differences. For sure is important. And continuing on that topic of engaging in dialogue, the Black community, Black Walnut High School students and alumni, and many, many students too, like we mentioned, are realizing that it's our fight. We're all angry, and I think it's a brave and beautiful thing for Black people to be reclaiming their voices. And starting up this program, we wanted those students to know that their anger is valid and their pain and their trauma is heard and will not be dismissed. So, Brandon, how do you think we can kind of channel our anger in a responsible way to fuel the movement?
That's a thick question, right? The one thing I've learned through this whole thing, and I'm going to try to keep this as short as possible, but the one thing I've learned during all these different events is it's hard to tell somebody how to process a particular feeling, right? People always, they like to criticize the protests, right? They like to criticize how people get out there and show their anger and frustration. And when I was out at one of the protests, again, you have a lot of different types of protests. But again, when you take a step back on it, you can't tell anybody how to protest or how to process their anger. So it's hard to do. I think for me, the one thing that I try to do, because I struggle with this, being a Black man who has had my many times where I've been pulled over and had guns in my face and been put on the hood of a police car. I struggle with this every single time. So I get very angry, but what I try to do is my channeling is more of speaking on it, right? I do posts on Instagram that are about what the issues are, right? I talk to those around me that have been in similar situations so that we can talk to each other and kind of quell each other, right? Try to keep each other level-headed, right? I get out there, right? I try to educate others on why I'm frustrated. Sometimes I've also learned that the ability to be able to explain to somebody why, as a Black man, I am frustrated and tired and sad and hurting. One, it gets them to be able to understand at a deeper level, but then two, it allows me to be able to talk about why I'm feeling these feelings, and it allows me to deal with it in a sense, right? So everybody has their different ways. So it's really hard, but for me, it's just a matter of trying to understand how I can do change. How can we get to change? And if that means I have to take my anger and put it into an Instagram post that shows all the different names of all the Black folks that have been killed by police, then I'm going to do that. If that means that I have to link up with all of my folks from Howard University and we're going to make a video telling people why we're tired of dying, then I'm going to do that. Those are all the different things for me, at least, is the way that it's better for me to channel.
Right. And yeah, like we're all saying, we're all kind of socialized to this worldview of, like capitalism and white supremacy, and almost to just kind of hurt the people who have hurt us. And we see that reflected on social media through things like cancel culture. So if you or if any of the other speakers have anything to add, like how can we continue to engage in that meaningful dialogue without, finger pointing or without, just like kind of being able to work together rather than against each other?
I'll start if y'all don't mind. So I think, so I think, like continuing to have meaningful dialogue, I think it's also important. It's also related to what I said about humility, because many of us, have known about the systemic racism, and everything like has gone on for some time, and echoing, what Brandon has said, everyone processes it differently. So I think, it's, very important, if you don't know anything, but you're aware of what's going on, why is it wrong, but you want to learn more about it, I think it's important to just, instead of just instantly going on social media and see something edgy or see something that's like, oh, really good point, and then just share without thinking, I think it's, super important to understand why certain things are going on, why people are, reacting this way, and just, just listen and just like internalize that, put yourself in their feet and ask yourself, how would you feel if you were in their shoes? And also, it's also important to, I would say, like, take time, to read up everything about, recent events, why they're happening, why, certain things have been happening the way they are, why people are reacting the way you are. I mean, honestly, I think at the end of the day, there's so much information to take in. You're not going you're not going to learn everything, but if you are able to kind of take what you can, understand it, and then be a meaningful ally and share it with people you think that would would benefit from learning that information. I think it is super helpful, rather than say having a quick social media blitz and trying to call people out for not knowing stuff, and try and cancel each other out, which I don't like. Again, as I said before, is not as productive as you would think, and especially in hindsight, is 2020.
I think another important thing, honestly, is just to talk to people, right? I mean, just talk. I mean, it's, you know, it's an uncomfortable conversation, but again, there's no need to finger point. Because if we want to finger point, we can do that to each other all day long, and that gets us nowhere. Right? It's just a rabbit hole that we'll go down, and we'll just continue to stay down in that hole, right? It's like a crab barrel effect, right? They talk about Blacks and Hispanics are in this crab barrel, and what we continue to do is point the finger at each other, and we keep holding each other down as we're trying to get out of this crab barrel. Well, that's not the way to go about it, right? So when you have these kind of situations, again, find somebody who maybe is in the middle of the situation and just ask them and just talk to them, right? And get a real sense of what's going on from their perspective. And we have to do a better job of trying to understand what's going on in these heated times from other people's perspective, and just try to understand it. We're not always going to understand it, but at least the idea of asking someone, it shows compassion, it shows that you care, but it also shows that you're willing to listen and to learn. And hopefully somebody will show you that same respect for whatever you may be going through.
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead, Joyce.
I was going to say, Brandon, I completely agree. And I think, you know, something I've been reflecting on a lot lately is, I mean, it's two things. It's like the first is positionality, right? The idea that as an Asian American woman, I enter this conversation really differently than my Black friends do. And I think because of that, it's been making me reflect a lot on, you know, what is my role in either calling out or calling in the people I know, particularly around issues of police brutality and racial injustice against the Black community. I think that's an example where, like, I identify as a person of color, but those are not issues that I personally struggle with. And I think my role in acting in solidarity in these moments is, like, I mean, there's lately, you know, there's so many people who have been entering the conversation. I think that's really great. I can say it has felt like a very long, however many years to get to this place. And now I see a lot of friends and family of my own entering the conversation. And I think it's really easy to say, like, well, where were you 5 years ago? Where were you when Michael Brown was killed? Where were you? Like, this has happened so many times. And I think there is kind of this inclination to say, like, well, you know, how dare you show up now? But I think at the end of the day, I also know that my goals are to bring people along with me, and, like, calling out people for things they've done in the past, you know, some of that is important, some of that is maybe less productive, and getting them to come along with me. And so I've been thinking a lot about the differences between calling out and calling in, and how they are really different tools. Like Willis was saying, calling out is about, like, holding people accountable, particularly people in positions of power, right? But for me right now, it's like, if my family and my friends are willing to listen and engage in this conversation, like, let me call them in. Let me sit down and have that conversation with them, so that, you know, when it's time for step 2 or 3 or 4, they're still going to be there.
Absolutely. I think I definitely agree with everything that's been shared so far. I think kind of similar to what Joyce was saying, I've been thinking about my evolution on these issues from when I was at Walnut to where I am now. And I want to make sure that everyone who's tuned in, who's either still in high school or has recently graduated, I don't want you to think that you're at a disadvantage necessarily just because you're still in high school, that you don't have the capabilities or the resources available to you to enact these changes. I think I owe a lot of the exposure and introduction to the issues that I care about and advocate for now to my education at Walnut. I still so vividly remember my like senior year English class like syllabus, and how diverse and rich those texts were, reading from Black feminist authors, reading from Latinx authors, and Asian American authors. I think it was really just an incredible exposure and experience that helped, I think, set me up for what was to come outside of Walnut. I think I also want to recognize, thank you, Joyce, for Janine, for positioning the question the way you did. I think it's important to reflect on how we can fuel the movement with responsibility. And I think that goes back to sustainability, right? We see that Black Lives Matter isn't necessarily
internet. Darn.
Oh,
No,
we have
definitely summarize all of your points. Yeah, I think, you know, we're all trying to lead towards the path of just like nourishing.
complacent. So I think one way you can be sustainable in your actions and your thoughts is, sorry, I thought my internet went out for a little bit. One way you can be sustainable with your actions and your thoughts is finding issues that are personal to you, that you truly care about, because that's the way that you'll get invested. And I think, like we touched on earlier, systemic racism really touches so many institutions and systems within our different communities, whether it's in the education system that you're learning in or working in Joyce's position, or it's in the political sphere where Willis and I more work in. I think one of the pivotal, I guess, moments for me was having a class in college on the history of prisons in the US, which really just brought all of these issues to the forefront and really forced me to reckon with how present these issues are. Because I think we talk a lot about racism in the past tense, right? There was slavery, there was Reconstruction, there are Jim Crow laws, but a lot of the intentions behind these discriminatory policies and actions are still so deeply rooted in what we have today. We have voter disenfranchisement that's rampant throughout the US. Like Georgia had its primary pretty recently, and they have like an insane exact match policy where your driver's license that you show when you show up to vote has to match exactly as what's on the voter file. And that already puts so many people of color, Black people, Indigenous people at a disadvantage. I know, for example, for myself, Filipino culture is a little bit funny, where we have kind of like two first names. So like, and I think when I registered for my license at the DMV, I had a Texas birth certificate, which was like a small mini version that looks like a social security card. So my full name wasn't even on it. It was like Charmae and Astillero. So if I were to vote in Georgia, my vote would not have counted. So I think it's important to think about these things in, I think, a broader spectrum, which is a very long, circuitous way to come to find the issues that really matter to you and see how race and discrimination affects it, whether it's reproductive rights, whether it's voting rights, whether it's equity in education. There's so many causes to care about, which is distressing that we're in this position, but it's also, I think, a good opportunity to find what you're passionate about. So to get there, it's, I think, just, again, exposing yourself to different texts, different authors, different activists on Instagram or Twitter.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, you know, like racism is everywhere and it's so present. And we have a student question here. It asks, how to respond to microaggressions directed not at me, but at my friends. So, you know, it seems like the student no longer wants to be a bystander, you know, like when witnessing racial microaggressions towards people around him. How can he respond to those people saying those, you know, like racist things that might not be outright racist, but are microaggressions?
I can start since there's an airplane flying overhead and I think it's picking up noise on my computer. So Janine, the question is, how do I, as a bystander, respond to a microaggression that I'm witnessing?
Yes, yeah, so exactly. One that you're
Yeah,
against you, but at a friend.
totally. I mean, I think one thing that's really important is first, like, check on your friend. Is your friend okay? I think like making sure that your friend is okay and has a chance to respond if they want to is really important. I think the other, you know, it's obviously a balance, and relationships are so key in all this, and positionality again is key. If if you know your friend doesn't want to respond, that's totally fine too. If you feel like you want to be the one to address that, I think um, it's really important to focus on the impact, right, of a microaggression. I think oftentimes there's intent and then there's impact, and oftentimes like the intent isn't necessarily good either, but people don't think through the intent of what they're saying. So you'll hear, you know, things like, it was a joke, I was just kidding, I didn't mean it. And I think it's really important to say, like, at the end of the day, like, what you said was hurtful. And and there's a space to then have that conversation, whether it's continuing to call in or calling out, holding people accountable. But I think it's starting with really focusing on, you know, when you said that, like, that had a hurtful impact.
Right, right.
Yeah, I think Joyce brought up great points. I think if anyone was tuned into the first series conversation, I think Nikki Carrasco brought up some really great tactical ways to address this. If it was a verbal microaggression, one great way to start that conversation is asking, well, what do you mean by that? Which I think is a very direct way to address that there was a misunderstanding or a gap, a knowledge gap there, while not necessarily putting someone on the spot or making them feel like they're immediately being canceled or what have you. It's a great way to start that conversation. Or she also mentioned if it's someone in a position of power and you feel uncomfortable speaking truth to power, as Willis had mentioned, you can go about it in kind of a joking, light way where you just kind of brush it off as, well, I hope you didn't mean that. I hope you didn't mean how you said that. And questioning their intent behind what they said.
Right. And Charmae.
Sorry, real quick. I want to say, I'm going to come at this from a maybe a different side of it. All right. So I'm going to say this: if you feel like somebody has said something to you, so I'm assuming the question is like, if somebody says something to you that you didn't appreciate, how can you address it? Is that another way of seeing it, or am I seeing it wrong?
Sorry, can you repeat the way you rephrased that?
You said what? I'm sorry.
Yeah, the question was how to respond to a microaggression, not directed towards that actual person, but one that he or she was hearing.
Okay. Maybe I think maybe what I was going to say may not have necessarily been. So I guess I'll hold off.
Okay, no worries.
On that.
So, before we leave the topic of social media, Charmae, if you wouldn't mind answering this question, I know you have experience working in digital strategy. The question is posting on social media jumping on the bandwagon? Should students make social media posts? And what is it that makes a post meaningful and not performative?
Yeah, I think that's definitely an important question to ask ourselves, and something that I myself have to constantly check in to make sure that I know we throw around the word performative allyship a lot, but it's true. I think social media has immense power, right? We can organize there, we can educate there, we can learn things from there. So it is absolutely a powerful tool in disseminating information. Like in the early days of the protests, we were able to see so many instances of police brutality against the protesters who were protesting against police brutality, ironically enough, because of social media, because they were able to share these posts to relevant audiences in a timely manner. And they had the reach and the opportunity to go viral and just really share those messages. I think with that, are you, as you post and as you see things on your feed, constantly asking yourself, well, who is this for? Who's this serving, right? Am I posting it because it's informative and I learned something from it, and perhaps my fellow peers might be coming from different social circles where they're not following the same people as I am. Am I adding to the conversation, or am I doing this in a way where I feel like this is my action and this is what makes me feel like I'm doing something? Or is it, are you doing it out of guilt perhaps because you feel like you're not doing enough, which is a separate issue. So I think it's important to always assess your intention behind it and who it's for, right? Is it for you? Are you doing it because you feel like you haven't done enough to speak up for your Black friends? Or because the very thing that could be missing is that while you may be posting on your social media, on like Twitter or Instagram, you're not having those conversations directly with your Black friends. So I think it's important, if you're sharing posts online, to also make sure that you're doing the work offline. So whether that's having those conversations with friends, with family, reading books about our different histories, or learning more about what you learn in school, because I think this might be more specific to some of the juniors on here, or I guess the newly appointed seniors who've just gone through U.S. history. But there's definitely a lot there, but there's a lot that I think wasn't addressed like in depth. I remember the first time I learned about the Tuskegee experiments, just being so shocked and horrified that something like that was allowed to happen and that we didn't learn about it in school. So I think always looking at texts that you see, whether they're in the educational context, like in school, or on Instagram or on Twitter, thinking about them critically, right? I think like one of the popular like journalism tenets is, well, who is this written by? Who is it written for? And who is not included in this narrative, right? So always addressing, I think, the different types of information you're presented with in a very holistic way.
Right, and definitely I am really, appreciating all of the posts that we're seeing on social media. And, we talk about this moment being the spark for so many people who may not have been, talking about racism and these issues as much as they are currently now. And, we think back to movements back in the day, and we kind of remember, like the mind's eye remembers the big names. We remember like MLK and Malcolm X, and, we remember people like Angela Davis. But really, those are the things that, ordinary people like you and I, and like, Walnut High School students, we're all, being part of this movement to move together. And I think social media definitely is one way in that. And moving on, so here's a student question we received. There are many young people at Walnut High School who do want to get involved, but don't have, the same means as all of us, such as social media and making donations. The question is, please explain how a 15-year-old student with no access to social media or no money to donate due to strict parenting can help the movement and help make a difference. And anyone would like to start with that question?
I'll dive in. I think sometimes we get caught up with this idea of thinking that helping means money, right? Sometimes we get caught up in this thing of thinking that helping means being out in front of something, right? Sometimes a lot of the work, when work really gets done, it's those that are behind the scenes is where the things really happen, right? So I think the ways you can get involved, right? One, think about it. The people that are being that are having issues, that are, and I'll just go ahead and just say, just with the time that we're in, Black folks, right? If you have somebody that is around you that you feel like is in that category, that is dealing with something, whether it's mentally, whether it's emotionally, whatnot, sometimes just talking to them, providing an ear, providing a shoulder is helping and is being a part of the movement, right? Being a resource for them for whatever they may need, again, is helping, right? Sometimes it's not always the big stuff. It's a bunch of little steps that equal big steps and then equals change. So I think we just have to be okay with recognizing that, yeah, we're not all going to be able to do the big social media blasts or the financial blasts. But if I have someone that I care about, that I know that is hurting during this time, or that is experiencing something, and if I can go to them, and if I can speak to them about what they're going through, and they can educate me about what it is that they're going through, and then I can in turn talk to somebody else and explain to somebody else why this movement is happening, why people don't trust certain things, whatever, whatnot, then I'm pushing the movement, right? I'm just not doing it out in front of everything, but the line is still being pushed and the movement is still rolling. So, you know, it's little things. Don't feel like you have to do something big. Just start little and then go from there.
Right. Joyce, I see you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And I think there's lots of ways. I think Brandon gave some really great examples of how to give your time and other resources, not just money. I think another way to do that might be volunteering. And I think the other piece that's really heavy on my mind right now is like, I think it's really important to acknowledge that other people of color can also be, can hold racist beliefs in their head, right? I think part of doing this work is also doing the work on ourselves. And so if you know, particularly right now in regards to Black racial justice, if you're looking for ways to support and you do not identify as Black, like I would challenge the people on this call to be educating yourself and doing the work to understand like what are the things that you've learned about race and how it works, because I think that's really important too.
I'm sorry, can I say one more thing? Because Joyce, what you just said I thought was a great point, just in the sense, and I think Charmae actually said the same thing too about the idea of reading and educating yourself about some of these things. And so, and Charmae brought up the Tuskegee experiment. And so I always, being in medicine, right, a lot of people try to understand why Black folks don't trust medicine as an institution in a sense. And there's a great book out there called Medical Apartheid, right? And it is a book that talks about the history of African Americans and medicine. And inside that book, you learn about the Tuskegee experiment, but you also learn about things about how in South Carolina, the medical school out there used to dig up the Black bodies and would, without asking the families, and use those bodies for their medical experimentation. There was Barnum and Bailey, and how Barnum and Bailey, as we know this to be this great circus thing, what they used to do is they took a middle-aged Black woman, pulled out all of her teeth without any anesthetics, and put her on the circus and said she was the world's oldest person. Right? There's all these different things that have shown as to why Black folks don't trust medicine. But unless you read these things, unless you're educated on these things, then you actually have no idea. But you also understand why Black folks don't trust a lot of things based in that book. So I just like the point that you guys made, just educating yourself. Read some of these books. And again, that's being a part of the movement, because once you read that book, then you have an understanding, and now you can push that line to somebody else. I just thought it was a great point.
Absolutely. I think I totally agree with everything that Dr. Henry brought up. I think as we talk about finding the resources out there and educating yourself, it's also important to think about the role that that fiction has in this. There are some amazing authors like Toni Morrison, Jacqueline Woodson, who've written so eloquently and precisely about things like generational trauma and inherited trauma, some things that definitely are symptoms of systemic racism that we've seen from practices like the Tuskegee experiment or the massacre of Black Wall Street. There are a lot of I think there are a lot of fiction stories that are great introductions to a lot of these histories and thoughts of practice. I think it's also important to think about activism in functionalities other than social media and resources, as we've touched on. And I'm definitely going to age myself here, but time is such an important resource, and definitely something I know that a lot of us wish we had more of. And you guys right now are in such an amazing position where you have the time to talk to your friends, to educate yourself, to organize and activate on issues that matter to you on a personal level or individual level as well. Activism can be something like organizing against discriminatory dress codes at your school, or starting petitions and crowdfunding to eliminate school lunch debt, something that so disproportionately affects a lot of students of color, Black students, brown students. Or it could even be pushing to include or exclude certain texts that you're reading in school. So I think there are a lot of ways that you can affect change on an individual level, on a community level, in ways that are absolutely impactful.
More than the individual level and more of a like collectivist kind of mindset that brings us to other forms of change. And, you know, we talk about different ways to bring about change. And we know now that, you know, there's not just one way to be able to keep the momentum and sustain the movement, and how, you know, we can all be part of the solution in different ways. So here's a closing question. You each can take about 30 seconds answering this question. It's, what can students do now, and what's one thing you recommend students to do the next week or month to get started in order to lead to change in the long run?
So I guess what can students do now, and what one thing you recommend students can do in the next month or next week to get started? Especially for students that are just graduated from Walnut High School and are about to head off to college. I think one thing you can do now is to get registered to vote, because that's really important, and you're able to express your voice, express your opinions in upcoming elections. And especially too often, young folks and people of color don't go out to the polls often. They think that, you know, these issues don't matter to them. You know, these issues are not going to impact my life. Why should I vote? Why am I participating in this process? I'll tell you right now that voting, whatever levels of office you're voting in, is very impacting and can actually make a lot of change in your day-to-day life. I would say one thing, and for high schoolers that are not of voting age yet, I think one thing you think about doing in the next month or next week, next month to get started is, I think, like echoing like the last point we just talked about, is doing the behind the scenes work, kind of read up on all the texts about why like the systemic racism has been happening, why this has been happening for some time, and then going out and echoing what everyone said earlier, just going out and talk to people, learn from your peers, and then start educating each other. And if there are big issues that come up in your local community or in your school, then start organizing and start talking to your peers, start organizing, and start demanding change that you think would be beneficial. And one last thing I'd like to say before I hand it off is, when you're organizing around an issue that you're passionate about, you want to make sure that you're adopting an issue that you're passionate about and are able to sustain in depth and be able to sustain engagement over a long period of time. Because at the end of the day, if you want sustained change, you need to keep going at it. You need to make sure that people hear your message. You need to make sure people are convinced by why your issue is important and why you're able to bring them to your side. This is why the Black Lives Movement is so successful, especially in light of recent events in this past month, because they're so sustained. They adopted the issues that were so important to them, and they kept amplifying at it, even when people didn't believe them, until the critical inflection point happened not so long ago.
Yeah, thank you, Willis. And I'll just repeat the closing question again to the other three speakers. What can students do now, and one thing you recommend to students to lead to change in the long run? So, Charmae or Brandon, if you would want to answer in about 30 seconds, time permitting.
Go ahead, Charmae.
Yeah, definitely. I can jump in here. I think one thing I would love everyone here to do is have that conversation that you've been putting off, right? Yes, it's going to be hard. Yes, it's going to be uncomfortable, but it's that important and it can't be held off any longer. So whether it's with your friends, your family, start those conversations, because if anything, even if it doesn't go well, it's practice, right? You're able to see that, think of it as like a debate practice almost, right? You're able to practice your arguments, your counter arguments, so that you're better able to refine your message and communicate your arguments when you continue to have these conversations, hopefully. And then I think, kind of similar to what Willis was talking about in terms of voting, I think it's also important to recognize the space that you can hold, even if you're not of voting age, within like politics. There are so many campaigns going on, especially in this presidential cycle. There are local elections, state Senate elections, the presidential election, of course. But there are also ballot measures that are happening, propositions that we'll be voting on. Last week, we learned that California will be voting on affirmative action, and that's so incredibly important, I think, especially in the context for Walnut students and for someone like myself, where, as we saw in a recent Harvard Supreme Court case where they tried to try affirmative action, they so often try to use this model minority mentality against Black people and Asian American people in particular, and try to pit us against each other. But even though our struggles are not the same, I think we've touched on this earlier, we still have to keep fighting and keep that solidarity up. So whether it's volunteering for a campaign, I know scary sometimes, like doing those voter call downs and calling strangers on the phone. Like, I hate talking on the phone as a young millennial. But I would say that volunteering for campaigns that I did in college, my only regret is that I didn't do it sooner and I didn't do it when I was in high school, because it's great practice. You meet so many like-minded people, so many passionate people who are able to introduce you to those ideas outside of this bubble that we've been talking about. And yeah, it's a great way to just organize within your community specifically. So like Willis said, identify those issues that matter to you, whether it's more local or more national, and find ways to get involved.
Have so many, great answers and input. So if it's okay with the participants, we're going to go a little bit over time. But Joyce and Brandon, do you have anything to add?
Go ahead, Joyce.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of great ideas thrown out already. So I guess just to quickly add one more thing, I think people have already alluded to this today. Like, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And this is definitely a rock we are pushing uphill every day. And so I think part of what's really important in all of this is like identifying two things. Like, one, what is the thing that is going to help you keep pushing? Whether that's challenging yourself, like Charmae was saying, continuing to have those conversations. Like, what is the one action you can take to keep pushing yourself outside of your own comfort zone? The flip side to that, the second thing is, what is the one thing that you can do to continue sustaining yourself? How do you be mindful of the limitations, like, and know when you're approaching them? Because, if you end up burnt out, it's really hard to keep going. So I think balancing those two things, and that's just kind of a ongoing struggle. But I think those two things are really important.
And last thing I'm gonna say is if this is something you believe in, because not everybody's gonna believe in this, right? But if this is something that you believe in and you want to see that change, then get active. The other part I'll say is educate your mind. All right, just educating yourself on why this movement is happening will give you a much more of a historical context. It'll give you much more body, it'll give you a stronger base to stand on, so you'll feel even more empowered to help keep the momentum going. So read, learn a little something. It'll make you feel good about it too.
Yeah, definitely. And, to summarize all of what you guys are saying, I also think, what we're all trying to get at is, like, show up imperfectly, like, don't be afraid to be wrong. Don't aim for perfection, aim for consistency when it comes to this movement and when it comes to advocating for Black lives and all of the other issues, our country is facing right now. So just thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panel for speaking, for the participants for attending. I'm so energized and inspired to continue to learn from all of you and my experiences and from the Walnut community. And just a reminder to participants, the speakers are available by email. If you have any follow-up questions, contact information will be sent in a follow-up email. And yeah, finally, all of this we talked about, like Joyce mentioned, can lead to activist burnout. So just be on the lookout for the last conversation on self-care in the coming weeks. Don't forget to follow at outsideurbubble.whs for updates. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.